In the deserts of North Africa, the deadliest thing is often not the crack of gunfire. Gunfire at least means you know where the enemy is. What is truly terrifying here is what comes after the silence. When endless yellow sand swallows every sound, swallows every footprint, and swallows your sense of direction until a feeling of being lost seeps out from between your bones. The lines on a map are a gentle lie in this place. The sun is the only judge that is fair and cruel at once. It uses heat to evaporate every drop of water inside you, and it uses shifting shadows to quietly rewrite your sense of position. Here, being lost is not a risk. It is an immediate, slow death sentence. In that sense, the desert is not only scenery, but a force that negotiates with no one. It does not care about courage, rank, or intention. It cares about exposure, consumption, and time. You can be brave and still die of thirst. You can be cautious and still drift a few degrees off course until the world stops making sense. The most dangerous moment is often when you feel certain, because certainty encourages you to stop checking. Out here, the simplest disciplines, looking back at your readings, arguing politely over a compass, writing down what you think you saw, are not rituals of neatness. They are rituals of survival, the only way to keep your mind from surrendering to the blankness. And yet, on the North African front in 1940, there was a group of men whose core contract was precisely to walk into that kind of disorientation on purpose. They were not going to seize ground. They were going to find out what the blank spaces on the map actually contained. The Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, was formally established in July of that year. The official record is spare and solid, a unit for long-range reconnaissance and deep operations behind enemy lines. But behind that single sentence was a thoroughly unconventional logic of war. While main formations grappled along narrow routes, the campaign still depended on what lay beyond the horizon: supply tracks, landing grounds, assembly areas, the quiet machinery that allowed armies to keep moving. When the main forces were pinned to the coastline and its narrow roads, depth became its own kind of battlefield. An airfield hidden inland could shift the tempo of sorties. A supply track that looked insignificant on paper could be the artery that kept a front alive. To learn those facts, someone had to go far enough that rescue was no longer a plan, only a hope. The LRDG was built for that distance, not to win by holding ground, but to win by removing ignorance. Their value was measured less in captured terrain than in the reduction of uncertainty, the difference between moving with a purpose and wandering into a trap. So these men became a special kind of taxi driver in the desert. Only their meter did not measure distance. It measured the probability of staying alive. The passengers they had to deliver were not living bodies, but intelligence that could set the tempo of a campaign. The fare was paid in 3 disciplines that had to be perfect: navigation, endurance, and concealment. Their war began with accepting a counterintuitive proposition: that distance itself was the first enemy. To turn distance into a weapon, you first had to tame it. That meant understanding, before you set out, that you were not facing an enemy force waiting to exchange fire. You were facing a chain of survival problems, each linked to the next. The convoy's real battle began the moment it crossed into the emptiness where no one could see it, help it, or even prove it existed. In that emptiness, small errors did not stay small. A missed bearing could become a missed water point. A minor delay could become a serious fuel deficit. The desert made every mistake compound, and it did so without drama. The first hurdle, and the most basic, was navigation. In a sea of sand, there are no road signs, no permanent landmarks. After a single windstorm, even yesterday's dunes may have moved. What you had were the stars overhead, the sun beside you, the miles accumulating under your wheels, and those stretches of terrain that looked identical until you learned to read their tiny differences. Bands of rock, dry wadis, a subtle change in color or slope. The map did not give you certainty. It gave you a hypothesis, and the desert forced you to prove it step by step. By the accounts of survivors in their memoirs, LRDG navigation was less an art of finding the correct direction than a relentless silent war against error. They did not expect to be flawless. In the desert, that would be a miracle, not something human beings could achieve. What they pursued was the ability to discover a mistake quickly and correct it before the error expanded into something irreversible. They assumed drift was inevitable. Their discipline was built around catching drift early, when it still looked like a small inconvenience rather than late, when it became a verdict. That is why their navigation looked like procedure rather than inspiration. Bearings were taken on a schedule and logged, distances were tallied and compared, observations were recorded in a way that could be revisited and argued over, because argument, in this context, was a safety mechanism. Nobody was allowed to assume that the last reading was correct just because it felt right. The desert punished feeling first. What mattered was repeatable method: check, record, compare, and adjust. Picture the coldest hour before dawn. The navigator climbs onto the roof of the vehicle and uses a sextant to catch the position of a star, establishing a baseline. After daybreak, the sun's track and a precise compass become the day's anchor. But the most important instrument may have been the odometer, forever ticking forward. Direction, distance, and then an almost obsessive practice of watching and recording the rise and fall of the ground, an outcrop of rock with a distinctive color, the angle at which a wadi abruptly bends. These were the sparse coordinates by which they located themselves on a blank canvas. A tiny error in a reading can begin as no more than the thickness of a needle. After driving 100 kilometers, that needle becomes a curved blade aimed at your throat. You might miss a planned water point, blunder into an enemy patrol zone, or worse, run out of fuel and end up in a featureless ocean of death. The discipline, therefore, was ruthless. Check bearings on schedule. Compare the ground to those trivial features on a map. Treat even a fleeting shadow on a sand slope as worth attention. A saying circulated among veterans: in the LRDG, a good navigator was worth more than an infantry platoon, because what he controlled was not the outcome of a single firefight, but whether an entire convoy could continue to exist on that battlefield. Direction could be forced, barely, into a complex set of procedures. Then the desert showed its second card, greedier than the first: consumption. Here, every liter of water, every gallon of fuel, every intact tire was real combat power. Beyond the nerve-shredding work of navigation, the essence of long-range reconnaissance looked more like a cold discipline of logistics engineering. The convoy was not going out to fight. It was going out to stay alive long enough to observe, and then to stay alive on the way back. The vehicles were their mounts and also their greatest weakness. Modified American Willys Jeeps and, later, Chevrolet trucks carried the burden. But the steel machines groaned in the desert. Daytime heat pushed the engine temperature needle toward the red. Radiators roared, and what they inhaled was often not cool air, but scalding wind and fine sand. Sand got into everything. It acted like the finest abrasive, testing every filter and every bearing. Tires were another nightmare. Sharp rock and baked ground could end a mission with one puncture at the wrong time. So the convoy carried absurd amounts of spare parts: tires, water tanks, fuel cans, tools. These loads ate fuel, but they also were the only lifeline available. Among all supplies, water was the supreme king. It stopped being a daily convenience and became strategic material that demanded careful calculation. Each man's ration, engine cooling, even emergency wound cleaning, each drop had weight and value. According to many recollections, the deepest fear was not the enemy's muzzle. It was the mental arithmetic that flared when someone glanced at the water level in a can or the trembling red needle of the temperature gauge as it climbed. Those signs meant you might be losing the capital that would buy your return. At night in camp, everyone except the sentries fell asleep instantly. But in the silence, you could hear another sound, the small clicking of metal as it cooled. The day's heat was leaving. The vehicles were breathing, preparing for the next brutal day. The convoy moved like a cautious migrating herd. Advance, rest, repair, advance again. Long before any contact with the enemy, Their combat power was already expressed in that extreme management of their own depletion. Remaining range in the fuel tanks mattered as much as ammunition in the magazine. When precise navigation and strict logistics finally carried you across hundreds of kilometers of no man's land to the edge of a target area, the most contradictory challenge appeared. You had come all this way in order to see, but to bring back what you saw, you first had to make yourself disappear. Visibility, the condition of being seen, turned from ally into the most dangerous enemy. In a bare desert, hiding a convoy is no easier than hiding a chess piece on a glass board. Disappearance was not a mood, it was a checklist. The convoy had to think like an object that wanted to avoid being outlined. It meant choosing ground that broke the vehicle's shapes, not simply ground that felt low. It meant parking where shadow would stay long enough to matter, then arranging spacing so that a single glance from above would not read as a line of machines. Even the act of stopping had to be managed. Tracks had to look like incidental marks rather than a deliberate turn. Movement had to be minimized at the hours when light made contrast harsh. And the men themselves had to treat their own bodies as reflective surfaces, a flash of skin or metal capable of betraying the whole effort. In an empty desert, concealment was less about hiding behind something than about refusing to announce yourself. The LRDG developed strict concealment discipline. They parked on slopes that faced away from the sun to use shadow. Vehicles spread into formations less likely to be spotted from the air. Every reflective object was covered. In daylight, they were usually motionless, merged with sand and stone. Observation posts were placed on high ground. With binoculars and sketchbooks, men worked like instruments. They did not record heroic battle scenes. They recorded dull but decisive data. How often trucks passed along a dirt road, what kinds of aircraft appeared and disappeared on an airfield, how a camp's tents multiplied or thinned. In those details, intelligence gained its muscle. Once hidden, the work narrowed to a single obligation: observe without becoming a story. An observation post was not a place to daydream. It was a station with assigned sectors, timings, and a standard of note-taking that assumed fatigue would lie. Men scanned in slow sweeps, paused on any movement, and returned to the same reference points repeatedly so that changes could be caught rather than imagined. When a road was watched, what mattered was not only how many vehicles passed, but whether the flow was steady, whether the spacing suggested discipline or hurry, and whether the pattern changed from one period to the next. When an airstrip was watched, the point was not romance or fear, but categorization, count, type, and change over time. The sketchbook, used well, became a tool for memory that did not rely on memory, and intelligence had value only if it could be redeemed. What was observed had to be translated into a form that headquarters and the Air Force could understand and use. That led to one of the most dangerous stages: communications. The radio was a lifeline, and also a beacon that could expose them. Strict radio silence was normal. Only at the most critical moments would there be a brief, encrypted transmission. The tension of waiting for a transmission window was no less than the tension of any battle. Redeemable intelligence had to survive translation. A commander behind the lines could not see the mirage, could not feel the heat, and could not guess which detail the observer meant to emphasize. So the LRDG had to turn observation into a language the rear could act on. Coordinates that could be plotted, counts that could be compared, and descriptions that avoided ambiguity. That also meant discipline in what not to send. If a detail was uncertain, it had to be marked as such or withheld. If a report could be misread, it had to be rewritten into something that could not. The difference between a useful message and a dangerous one was often not bravery, but phrasing. Imagine the scene. Absolute quiet, a signaller murmuring encrypted coordinates, everyone listening for an unfamiliar engine note in the air. Their job was not to become heroes. It was to be a reliable conduit for information. A steadier historical judgment might be this: the LRDG did not necessarily decide the direction of a campaign in a single action, but it significantly reduced the chance that Allied main forces would wander blindly and crash into walls across the vast desert. With discipline, they turned seeing into answers. The days of hiding stretched time thin and long. Under the blazing daytime sun, the convoy seemed to become part of the dunes. Only the eyes behind the binoculars moved, scanning the horizon slowly and meticulously. The observer's work was mind-numbing, yet it demanded nerves kept tight as a string. They could not afford to be poets marveling at the desert's breadth. They had to be accountants, logging a ledger of targets. Southeast Dirt Road, 0700 to 0900, 5 enemy trucks traveling west, average interval 20 minutes. Improvised airstrip, 2 new areas under camouflage netting that might cover hangars. Northern camp, more cooking smoke at dusk. These details, marked in neat handwriting on a sketch map, became the substance of intelligence. Every entry was a fight against fatigue and drifting attention. Wind-blown grit could blur lenses. Mirage could distort the view. Discipline required the men to separate reality from illusion. Their task was not to make history, but to polish the fog in front of the people who would. The process of sending intelligence out was often more dangerous than gathering it. The radio set was their only voice to the outside world, but it could also become a signpost that led death to them. Here, discipline reached a cold precision. Most of the time, the set sat silent, dumb as a stone. Only when a scheduled, brief communications window opened would the signaller transmit the most essential findings at maximum speed in encrypted code. Memoirs describe it as something usually done in the dead of night. Engines off, everyone holding still. Only the light tapping of the key mixed with the desert wind's low howl. Each press seemed to hammer out a huge sound in the silence, tightening the guards' chests. They had to finish before the enemy could use direction finding to lock onto the signal, then move immediately. It was not a firefight, but it carried the same pressure of living one step from death. Getting the message out was only a moment of relief. The real test began with the order to return. After transmission, relief was a temptation and therefore a threat. A successful message did not mean safety. It meant that time had started again, now with the added possibility that someone was looking. So they treated the minutes after sending as a second drill. The radio silenced, the set stowed, the sight stripped of anything that caught light, and the convoy shifted before dawn could make a silhouette. Only when they were settled again, indistinguishable from stone and sand, could anyone breathe as if breathing mattered. If infiltration behind enemy lines was the careful work of weaving yourself into the desert's background, then the return was the work of pulling that thread back out of a complex pattern, intact, and without drawing attention. On the way in, you were an unknown ghost. On the way out, you might be dragging the enemy's invisible alertness with you. The journey home often tested the system's resilience more than the trip out. Fatigue accumulated. Supplies were mostly consumed. Vehicle wear reached a critical point, and the mind, stretched for days, could finally develop cracks. You can imagine the scene. Deep night on the return route, a sandstorm erupts without warning and swallows the stars and moonlight. The world becomes nothing but roaring wind and rolling walls of sand. The convoy is forced to stop. Men curl inside steel shells, waiting for the chaos to pass. Hours later, the wind drops. The desert has been remade into a strange, featureless plain. The sun rises, but the landmarks used for positioning are gone. The navigator stares at his instruments and map. Sweat may gather on his forehead for reasons that have nothing to do with heat. At that moment, the stored body of navigation knowledge, memory of the stars, instinct for direction, absolute trust in distance readings, and the redundancy of pre-planned alternate routes and emergency rendezvous points become the only straw worth grabbing. This is not a lone hero's flash of inspiration. It is a whole methodology expressing itself under extreme pressure. The convoy might spread out to find an anchor point, then pull itself back together, slowly reassembling a position from fragments. Each decision could mean moving toward life or toward the edge of a void. Mechanical failure could make it worse. Behind enemy lines, there were no repair stations, no rescue trucks. The fate of a broken-down vehicle was written into the rules before departure. Repair if possible, If not, remove critical parts and intelligence, destroy the vehicle, and squeeze the crew into the remaining trucks to continue. Any emotional reluctance had to yield to the iron law of survival and mission. The decision was cold and practical. It reflected not abandonment, but absolute loyalty to the core goal: get the people and the answers home. By that stage, nothing was isolated. A storm, a breakdown, a bad reading, or a moment of impatience could turn into a chain reaction. Return was therefore not a simple reversal of the outward journey. It was the same system, but under harsher conditions. Less water, less fuel, more wear and more fatigue, all while the desert offered fewer recognizable anchors than before. The return route was a comprehensive field test carried out under sustained pressure, combining navigation, supplies, vehicle maintenance, and concealment discipline into one continuous trial. Any break in one link could trigger a cascading collapse. When the convoy, after all that, finally rolled back into the base behind friendly lines, trailing a long plume of dust, there were no flowers and no grand welcome. There were only soldiers, exhausted beyond speech, climbing down in silence, taking the first unrestricted mouthful of clean water with cracked lips. What they handed in were sketch maps whose edges had been worn down by sand, and notebooks packed with numbers. Those pages carried no personal glory. They carried answers: enemy movement, supply nodes, terrain features. Those answers might become coordinates for bomber targets. They might guide a flanking route for the main force. They might let an artillery unit deliver a lethal, perfectly timed barrage. Their victory was not measured in enemy bodies. It lay in turning many possible sacrifices into sacrifices that never had to be made. They traded hundreds of kilometers of wind and sand for the ability to add force in the correct direction, to feed the war machine where it mattered. Then came the quiet work that made the whole ordeal matter. The sketches were compared to other reports. The notes were read aloud and questioned, not to doubt the men, but to remove ambiguity before ambiguity became an order. Numbers were copied into summaries, landmarks described in plain terms, and timings converted into something planners could match against their own calendars. A rough hand-drawn line could become a refined reference. A counted convoy could become a target list. In that room, far from the dunes, intelligence stopped being personal experience and became a tool that other people could carry. The desert would soon erase their tracks. Wind and sand would cover the places where they had once hidden. When the war ended, the long-range desert group, like its mission, quietly dissolved and became a chapter in an archive. Yet what they left behind was more than a legend with a taste of adventure. They validated a method. In absolute emptiness and extreme harshness, you can use engineering precision and monk-like discipline to turn the unknown into the knowable and to turn distance from obstacle into tool. What endures is the method more than the footprint. They demonstrated that in an environment where the map lies and the horizon repeats itself, knowledge has to be manufactured, not assumed. It is manufactured by measurement, by redundancy, and by the willingness to treat your own perception as something that can fail. In their routines, checking and rechecking, rationing and recording, hiding and waiting. They proved that discipline can substitute for luck often enough to change a campaign's odds. Their work also hinted at a broader lesson. Firepower is only potential until it is pointed in the right direction. In that sense, the first weapon in the desert was not the rifle or the gun, but the ability to say with usable confidence where you were and what you had seen. Later, special operations theory drew nourishment from this model of deep penetration, long concealment, and reconnaissance as the primary focus. But the deeper legacy may be a philosophy of war. True advantage does not always come from the sharpest spear. Sometimes it comes from the clearest mind and the most exact measure. In the boundless deserts of North Africa, what often decided whether artillery range could become results was, first, knowing where to aim. The LRDG proved with their wheels and compasses that, in a certain sense, a sense of direction is itself a powerful and silent weapon. They were men who forged the craft of navigation into a key, so that, where there was no road, they could open a door for those who came after.